Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to Let's Have Renaissance, a podcast about writing, editing, publishing, literature, the arts, and more. I am Ito Otini.
And I'm Makaya Otini, and today we're speaking with Dean Rader. Dean is a poet, art writer, critic, and scholar. He's authored or contributed to 13 books, including his debut poetry collection, Works in Days, which won the 2010 T.S. Eliot Poetry Prize, and he's earned support from the MacDowell and Guggenheim Foundations, among others. We're excited to be with him today.
Thank you for tuning in. We're excited that you're here. Why don't you also subscribe, like, comment, and share this episode with your friends?
And if you know anyone who wants to come on the podcast, please do send them our way. Also, if you haven't yet, sign up for our free newsletter where we share updates, resources, and opportunities. To support the podcast, you can make a one-time donation through our website or purchase a subscription to our blog where you'll find more premium content and resources at thedatekeepers.com. Thank you for being a part of our community.
Dean, thank you so much for joining us. We're excited to have you. Can you please tell us about yourself and what are you working on now?
Hi, well, it's great to be here. My name is Dean Rader, and I'm beaming to you from San Francisco, California. And I'm primarily a poet, but I'm also an art critic and a translator and a scholar.
How did you become interested in art writing and criticism? Can you tell us a little bit about your history as an art critic?
I would say my interest goes back really to graduate school. My undergraduate degree is in English, but my master's degree is in comparative literature. And I was taking classes that had this kind of overlap between literature and visual culture, visual studies, film and art. I took some time off between my MA and PhD, and I really considered going back for a PhD in art history or art theory, history of art, visual culture, something like that. Ultimately, I got my degree in comparative literature, but one of my secondary fields was visual culture. My first book was actually, I co-authored a book with this guy named Jonathan Silverman, and it was how to decode visual culture, visual texts. So my interest in decoding visual spaces, visual texts, and the matrix between poetry and painting and poetry and visual culture has been there really since graduate school. And then I helped curate an exhibit on the Taos School of Painters, and I wrote an essay on pastoral poetry and landscape painting for that. And my most recent big book of poems was called Before the Borderless: Dialogues with the Art of Cy Twombly. And it's this combination art book, poetry book, where if you open the book, on the left-hand side of the page would be a beautiful color image of a Cy Twombly painting or drawing, and then my poem on the right-hand side of the page. It is both showing you things and telling you things. And that book seemed to have struck a chord with some people. And so I've been getting a lot of requests to write about art, write about a Twombly show. I wrote about this really cool exhibit at this museum, the Legion of Honor here in San Francisco, called Drawing the Line. And it was all these really important artists from Michelangelo all the way up to Ruth Asawa, just their drawings. And they asked me to review this show from the perspective of a poet. And I talked about how the moment of creation, when an artist sits down with a pencil on a piece of paper about to make a line, and a poet sits down with a pencil and a piece of paper about to make a line, how are those moments similar? And you might trace, and that's probably an intentional pun, my interest in these two things back to that moment. How are the similarities for the poet and the artist at this moment of creation? And our vocabulary is so similar: line, composition. And I'm curious as to reading paintings versus looking at poems, how those two acts are interchangeable, both from the viewer/reader and from the creator. That's a very long answer to your question, but it's super complicated in my case.
No, that's a great answer. And before we get too far into the art criticism world, let's also, I'd like to know a little more about your personal history as a poet and what your poetic preoccupations are and what your stylistic influences are. And if you believe in a voice, how you found it. If you don't believe in a voice, what you think is the main stylistic distinction that makes one poet different from another instead of voice.
Wow. You don't really lead with softballs on this podcast, do you? That was a good one. So my first book of poems is this book called Works and Days, and it talks a little bit, it's a clear reference to Hesiod's famous ancient Greek epic about farming called Works and Days. And I grew up in a farm town in Oklahoma. My grandparents were Dust Bowl survivors, and we had a family farm. We didn't work it ourselves when I was a kid, but my grandparents did. And we had that farm in the family right up until not very long ago. So this notion of farming, an agrarian lifestyle linked with poetry has been something that's interested me for a really long time. In that book, I'm doing a couple of things. It's divided into 3 sections, a section called Works, a middle section called and a third section called Days. And the first section is kind of me in conversation with works that had been important to me. The middle section is experimental poems. And then the last section is a series of poems that I wrote every day on my birthday about that day or the previous year for like, I don't know, 12 years, I think. And so in that book, I'm trying to connect the historical with the personal. And I'm entering into conversation with all these other poets that had been important to me. The first poem in the book is a poem about reading Wallace Stevens on an airplane flying back home to Oklahoma for my grandmother's funeral. So the whole book, even from the title, is asking how we enter into conversation with those voices who had been really important to us for really the course of our adult and writing lives. So in this case, I'm thinking about people like Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman and Wallace Stevens and Sappho. And there's a poem that talks to Pablo Neruda and a poem that talks to Charles Wright. And so I'm kind of not translating these people, but I am establishing a relationship, building a community, trying to start a conversation. So, my own voice, I would say, I worry that my voice is too ethereal, too abstract, on occasion too experimental. Reviewers have characterized me as being too rangy, to being democratic, to being experimental, to being a poet of the people. I've been characterized recently as being a political poet and an experimental poet, both of which are sort of exciting to me because I don't think of myself as either. I am just trying to write poems that make the reader feel like they are experiencing something. It's less about message and it's less about narrative and less about story. And I'm trying to activate something in their hearts and in their brains that makes them feel like they're experiencing something more than words.
That's the best. And what's become of the farm now?
It's still there. It was a wheat farm that was in our family for a century. And when my father realized that neither my sister nor I would ever move back and work the farm, he sold it and actually put the proceeds into accounts for us and for his grandkids, my 2 kids and my sister's 2 kids. So the farm lives on in some ways.
Do you feel like there are ways that your history, having grown up on a farm, still influence your life in direct ways, either in your creative work or your academic work or just in how you lead your life?
Maybe the best poem in the Cy Twombly book is a poem that compares this Twombly painting with our farm in Oklahoma. The color is what it makes me think of. And I recount this scene to my grandfather walking me around the farm after church one day. I do think that growing up in a small, rural, agrarian culture makes me aware of the potential pretentiousness of poetry and poets. Like anytime I write something, I think, oh, what would my grandfather think of this? Or, oh, what would my sister think of this? Or, oh, what would the people at the John Deere store in my hometown think of me going on about Cy Twombly? So I do think that it gives me a sense of reality, a kind of touch point to people's lives outside of San Francisco or academia or the poetry world. And there really is not much overlap between those three things and the place where I grew up.
Interesting. So when you're writing art criticism in particular, who do you imagine as your audience and how do you imagine them encountering and engaging with your work?
Oh, that's such a great question. I think about reader and readerships when I write art criticism more than any other thing I write. I have this collaborative poetry column with Victoria Chang for the Los Angeles Review of Books, and I review poetry regularly for other publications. I never think about readership there. I don't think about readership with poetry. I don't think about readership with scholarship, but I always thinking about it with art criticism. I think because I fear that I'm an imposter or that the art world can be, they can be really persnickety and and territorial and gatekeepy. And so I worry sometimes that they will think I'm a bit of a dilettante, someone outside of their world writing about their world. And there's a very precious vocabulary, in art criticism and art history and art theory. And so I am painfully aware of readership and audience when I'm writing about art. And what has really changed things for me is when I stopped thinking myself as an art critic and started thinking of myself as a poet and as a writer who's just writing about text. And if I just write about text and don't really worry so much about the art gallery audience or the audience of artists or the audience of art historians, then it tends to go just fine. I just can't pose as something that I am not.
And if you were to choose to be one of the three, whether just teach or art critic or poet, which one would you choose and why?
I would choose to be a painter. I would reject all those options.
Interesting. Wait, why?
I would love to be a painter. I think that would be really great. But my artist friends always wish they were writers. In fact, I did this long conversation with this great painter here in San Francisco, this guy named Jordan Cantor, for this magazine. They did an art issue and they asked us to be in conversation. And the conversation begins with Jordan's claim that he is a painter who wants to be on the shelf, and I'm a poet who wants to be on the wall. And that sounds about right. I think of those three, I'm still my best self as a poet. I wish in some ways I could be a novelist. I wish I could be a full-time art critic, but I am the most satisfied when I am making what I think are good poems. I'm the most dissatisfied when I'm making what I fear are not successful poems. So the pendulum swings pretty dramatically.
What makes a good poem, in your opinion?
I think when I read a good poem and my brain is just on fire, whether it's by me or someone else, and I can hear some sort of internal music and I can feel some sort of philosophical query, some sense of understanding or discovery. I really like poems that are groping for something, either sonically, like they're groping for a kind of internal music, some sort of rhythm that feels primal and vibrant and necessary, some kind of sonic inventiveness with sounds or line break or rhythm or the way the words land that is first and foremost aesthetic, that really activates my head, my heart, my ear. And then if there's something else going on meaning wise that reveals a thoughtful sense of understanding, I really love that. I tend not to respond to poems that are super confident. And I tend not to respond to poems that are utterly self-effacing and seem a little nervous about their own existence. I like poems that are confident in their structure and organization and form, but open to discovery. There's a famous quote by Robert Frost that's something like, no surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader. And I really love being surprised. If I feel like I come to a poem and the poet already has the answers and they're just telling me the answers, I'm immediately turned off. But if I feel like I'm engaged in a joint process of exploration and discovery, I'm all in.
So I think everybody has two sorts of fantasies. There's the fantasies that we actually wish we could have fulfilled. And maybe if we had the opportunity, we would reroute the course of our lives in order to fulfill them. And then there's the fantasies that really they're better as fantasies. We enjoy being able to harbor them as dreams, but the prospect of them actually becoming reality would actually be somewhat miserable. And if push came to shove, we would not choose that. And I'm wondering where you would put your interest in becoming a painter on that spectrum. Like, if you could go back and reroute the course of your life and you had to give up some of the things you're doing now, but you could become a painter, would you do it?
I think about that pretty often. My mother was a vocational painter. Her undergraduate degree was in art. She was a drug and alcohol therapist for her entire life. But she painted on the side and she would paint these little pieces as gifts to people. And she would paint these little slates for my kids. It was not what any of us would consider art with a capital A or art in quotation marks, but she was always painting. And my father collected art. Again, it was Western Oklahoma art that always had to have a windmill in it and like a barn, a broken down wagon. Again, nothing sophisticated, kitschy even, people might claim, but there was always art around and my mom was always working on art. So for a long time, I thought that I grew up deprived of any kind of culture, but it was a very narrow view of what culture was. It was just devoid of what we think of as high culture. But there was art around and painting around and creation around all the time. And it's really taken me almost my entire life to realize that. In fact, I just published this piece at the end of last year about encountering this sculpture, this basketball sculpture at this artist residency. And I encountered it one day and it literally brought me to tears. I just broke down right where I was and started weeping. I'm on my hands and knees in a rainstorm in the mud and I'm just crying at this overwhelming emotional response to the sculpture, which kind of in the piece I talk about how it's connected to my dad and his love for art and windmills. The very long answer to your question is probably it's best kept as a fantasy. And I've had all these opportunities to take art classes, and I have never taken an art class. And people always ask me, do you make art? You should really make art. You should try it. And I have not done that. I feel similarly about playing pro basketball. It's better my fantasy if I could go back and have a different basketball career and play in the NBA, would I do it? Now I think probably not. I probably chose the right path, though I'm jealous of painters and Steph Curry and blues guitarists. So I think I'm probably best not in those fields.
And if you were to choose your favorite project that you worked on, can you tell us which one and why?
The recent book, the Cy Twombly book, has been my favorite project to work on. I think because it collected all of these elements that I love, looking at art, being inside art, making poems that talk to art. I really think of this book as a collaboration between Twombly and me. He's dead, and who knows what he would think of my book. But I lived with those paintings. I wrote a lot of the book during the COVID lockdown. I would buy catalog raisonnés of the drawings on eBay during COVID, and I would get up at 4 a.m. and then just pour through these books and write these really obscure notes and poems. And some of the poems in the book became elegies for my father. And my mother died from COVID during the COVID lockdown while I had just finished a draft of the book. So the book is elegiac. I dedicate the book to my parents. So it was this tribute to them, and it was a love letter to Twombly, and it was a love letter to art, and it was a love letter to how poetry is curative, how it's healing. I think working on that book kind of saved me at a really difficult time. And something about that book kept me from despair. So I will always be grateful for that project. And the book is just so beautiful. My press did an amazing job, and the Cy Twombly Foundation loved it. It's really the first time that the estate of a major American artist had collaborated with a poetry press to make a book like this. So that is always going to be special for me. I can't imagine doing anything that would eclipse that in terms of its reach and breadth in my life.
We always ask guests to read a portion of their work.
Do you want me to read something from the Twombly book or from the more recent book of poems about music?
Why don't you read your favorite poem or two from each?
Okay. So I'll tell a quick story. Not long after my father died, my sister and I returned to Oklahoma to go through his things. We spent several days going through his effects. My father had been this really interesting guy, mayor of our hometown. He had run for state senate. He had won a hog calling competition. He was a state championship baseball coach, a bail bondsman. This really sort of larger than life figure. And when we went through his things, we were astonished at just how much stuff there was. Photos of politicians, plaques, ribbons, boxes of newspaper clippings. I kept asking myself, what makes a life? And then also, how does one contribute? And I went straight from Oklahoma to New York. I was giving a reading at NYU, and there was a Twombly retrospective of the drawings at the Gagosian Gallery down in Soho. And I went there late afternoon, and I was just mesmerized. And I kept looking at the Twombly pieces through the lens of my father's effects. And I was thinking, oh, these are Twombly's effects. And I kept asking the same two questions, like what makes a life and how does one contribute? And I realized that the Twombly path, the interior path, the aesthetic path resonated with me so much more than the more outward facing and probably in some ways more helpful and more generous and more community minded path of my father. And it really affected me. And they actually had to kick me out of the gallery that I was the last one there and I was lingering. And finally I went home and I walked along the High Line back to my hotel and I started scribbling down some notes that would become the first poem in the book. And that's what I'll read right now. So this is called Troubled by Thoughts About Infinity and Oblivion. I exit the Twombly retrospective at dusk and walk the High Line with the ghost of my father. This evening, the unknown waves its wand, and a beam of light disappears into the sky's black hat. The moon has never known its true home. The stars do not remember when they began their journey. Out of that forgetting, they begin their own making, just like us. Soon the sun will take off its cape and open a door to a place that is not there. Out of that absence, the questions. What black bones hang above the unseen? What name does the fire give to flame? What burns through existence to endlessness? We are not here long enough to believe in anything but language, and yet we know what awaits us is silence, somehow always rising above the darkness into darkness, always drawn to our own obscurity. Future self, I think of you, arriving at our ending. Last line on the last page, the trace within the vanishing, the final sleight of hand in which everything disappears. Remember, the unseen is never truly empty. And despite erasure, the canvas never blank.
Beautiful.
I love it. There you go. Good job.
Thank you. I appreciate that. That's the first poem in the book. And this is the final poem in the book. The book is bookended by these two poems that are thinking about all sorts of things. So this is called Once Again in Thought About Rilke, Twombly's Orpheus paintings, and fatherhood. I consider the inevitability of creation and loss. Scarred sky. The last beams bruised beneath the surface of stars. The whole world a contusion, slowly transforming from one thing to the next. The one cell, the one life, always becoming two. What if it is the sun that follows the moon? How do we know we're not the bridle hard against the teeth of this life? Just because something has a saddle doesn't mean we should ride it. What would it take to be inside the music the cello does not know how to play? What would it take to say to the strings, make me silent? What would it take for the skin to sing its own song of blood and blooming? To know one truth is to know nothing. To wear your nothingness, well, now we're getting somewhere. I once believed I could be lifted by language out of language. I once believed the horse hooves in the distance were the ocean telling the rocks about water. I once believed loss would thread my mind's needle like a blind seamstress. But that was a long time ago. Now I understand that time is nothing more than pure duration, and that the mind is a field of herons who have lost their way. Even so, I will let the entire lie down in my body's blue light in hope that something will start to heal.
Wonderful.
What was the line? Just because something has a saddle doesn't mean you should ride it.
Yeah, very good. That's it.
Yeah.
I love it.
Thank you.
And if you'd like to share one or two from your more recent book, that would be great too.
Yes. So the one that everyone always asks me about is the first poem in the book. And a couple of years ago, this poet and editor reached out to a host of poets, most of whom were really and are really famous, and a few of us who are less famous, and asked us if we'd be interested in writing a poem in response to a Taylor Swift song.
Okay.
And we were given the song. We were told, this is your song. And we were given all these restrictions. We couldn't say the title of the song in the poem. We were supposed to drop a kind of Easter egg in the poem that Swifties might be able to decode what song it was in relation to. And we literally had to sign an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement, that we wouldn't reveal the song or our poem or anything until the book came out. And it was published by, oh, I don't know, Random House, I think, on Taylor Swift's birthday. And the New York Times did a feature on it, and they ran this special where they reprinted 5 poems from the book, and then they let readers guess which song it was in response to. And one of the poems they picked was mine, and it was the first one in the feature. And so this is my contribution to the Taylor Swift book. This is called Creation. And on the 8th day, God was totally done with the haters. Nothing but complaints about acne, mosquitoes, unripe fruit. Where's my house? Where are my clothes? What's with the serpents? And so God did not bless the 8th day, and she did not rest. And she did not see that it was good, in part because God's boyfriend told her to clean up the areas around the swamps and make more mountains. His best work? An asteroid. Whatever. Has he even seen the firmament? She nailed it. Beaches, too. And Lord, the animals. They never shut up, but she doesn't mind. They are hers. And the color of the sky, she invented that. Same with fire. But she's saving the good stuff for later. Rain, earthquakes, ice storms, lightning. Wait till they hear thunder. Now that's godly. a reminder. At the present, though, it's all judgment, all critique, nonstop and rude. Everyone thinks she's getting it wrong, but wait until they hear birdsong, wave wash, leaf lilt, wind rush, river run. She made the howls of wolves, the bristle of cicadas, the puddles of rain, and all the cries. And she made the sounds of sticks and teeth and tongue and stone and skin and mouth and bone and sea and roar and wail and call and clap and sigh and gasp and moan and mew and chant and chirp and purr and trill and hum and laugh. She is making music. That's what they don't know. But they will, because everything is moving, everything vibrating in one great dance that is the act of becoming. Let there be light, and there was light. She will put behind her the darkness of day 8. Tomorrow is day 9, and she was born to create.
That is such a different mode.
Yeah, like it's Taylor Swift like.
I will tell you a quick story about that poem. So the song was Shake It Off, which is one of her most famous. So at the time, it was one of only 3 songs of hers that I had heard of. And so when I got the email from the editor and that I had been given Shake It Off, I was really nervous. So I went into the other room and I told my wife, I said, hey, look, I just got asked to write a poem for this anthology of Taylor Swift poems, and Pulitzer Prize winners and poet laureates are in this book. And I said, and I'm assigned a song. And she said, oh, what song did they give you? And I said, they gave me Shake It Off. And she paused and she said, well, you better not fuck that up. And I was like,
Well,
yeah.
and I don't think you did, so you took her advice.
Yeah.
Yeah, you did great. Well, again, thank you so much.
Thanks so much, guys. This was so fun. Your questions are super smart and engaging, and I really enjoyed talking with you.
Likewise.
Awesome. Thanks,
Awesome.
Dean. It was great
Take
talking
care.
with you.
Thanks, guys. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.